In the 18th century, the British Navy wasn't afraid of pirates, flying cannonballs, or massive ocean storms. They were absolutely terrified of lacking vitamin C. Yes, really. Scurvy was the absolute worst nightmare of the seas. It literally killed more sailors than enemy action. Imagine surviving a brutal, blood-pumping naval battle against the French or Spanish fleets, only to have your teeth literally fall out while you're eating a rock-hard sea biscuit a week later. So, how did a simple, sour lemon help Britain build the biggest global empire in history? Let's find out. Welcome to the era of wooden ships and iron men. Men who desperately needed a fruit salad. By the 1740s, the British Empire was expanding incredibly fast. They needed to project power across the globe. To do that, their wooden ships had to stay at sea for months without returning to port. No pit stops. But there was a massive problem. The typical naval diet consisted of salted beef, dried peas, and rock-hard biscuits. Fresh food? Rotting within a week. Vegetables? Non-existent on the open ocean. After a few months on this lovely diet, sailors started feeling utterly exhausted. Then, the red spots appeared. Their gums would swell up. Old, healed wounds would mysteriously open back up. And eventually, their bodies just shut down. During Commodore George Anson's voyage around the world in 1740, he lost nearly 1,400 men out of his 1,900 crew. Not to storms, not to the Spanish, but to scurvy. It was an absolute logistics crisis for the British Crown. To understand why they were dying, we have to look at what they were eating, or rather, what they were trying to chew. Ship biscuits were baked so hard they were often called teeth dullers, and usually they came with uninvited guests. Weevils. Sailors learned to tap them on the table to knock the weevils out, or, if it was too dark to see, they just ate them for extra protein. Then there was the salted beef. It was so salty and tough, it was sometimes used to carve souvenirs instead of being eaten. Imagine carving a ship out of a piece of beef. That's not a meal. That's a hobby. For months at a time, there was absolutely zero fresh fruit or vegetables. The ultimate recipe for disaster. Then entered Dr. James Lind. In 1747, on the HMS Salisbury, he decided to perform a very strange experiment. He took 12 sick sailors and divided them into 6 pairs. Each pair got a different treatment for their scurvy. Some got cider, some got sulfuric acid, some got vinegar, and others got seawater. The results were shocking. But 2 of them got oranges and lemons. Within days, those 2 were bouncing back to health. The cure was found. Lind published his findings, but the British Navy bureaucracy was slow. It took decades for them to finally act. Captain James Cook was different. In 1768, he insisted his crew eat sauerkraut and citrus fruit. The results were legend. Not a single death from scurvy on his long voyage. The Navy was finally convinced. The lime was the key. The British Royal Navy became an unstoppable force, able to stay at sea for as long as they wanted. The world was now theirs. From a simple piece of fruit to the largest empire in history. But what other problems did they have to solve? So, Dr. Lind found the cure in 1747, and Captain Cook proved it worked. Problem solved, right? Did the British Admiralty immediately give everyone lemons? Of course not. That makes too much sense. Fresh Mediterranean lemons were expensive, and the bureaucrats preferred cheap, completely useless alternatives. So, for another 40 years, thousands of sailors continued to rot away while the cure was sitting right there in a book. Finally, in 1795, a persistent physician named Gilbert Blaine forced the Navy to wake up and smell the citrus. An official daily ration of lemon juice was ordered for the entire fleet. The logistics were insane, but it worked. Sailors already drank grog, a mix of water and rum. Now, it came with a heavy, mandatory citrus kick. The result was immediate. The Royal Navy practically eradicated scurvy overnight. Their sailors became unbreakable. This gave Britain a terrifying military advantage. Their ships could blockade enemy ports for years without returning home. While French and Spanish fleets were constantly forced back to port by disease, the British just kept sailing and waving. Decades later, the Admiralty made a sneaky cost-cutting move. They switched from Mediterranean lemons to Caribbean limes. Limes actually have half the vitamin C, but they were grown on British-owned plantations, which meant they were cheaper. And this obsession with limes is exactly why American sailors and the world started calling the British limeys. That funny little nickname hides the ultimate secret weapon of the British Empire. They didn't just conquer the waves with cannons and gunpowder. They conquered them with vitamin C and a lot of patience. So, scurvy was finally out of the picture. But let's be honest. Life in the Royal Navy was still basically a floating wooden prison, which begs the question, how do you recruit thousands of men for a job that pays terribly, features bad food, and might literally blow your head off? Well, you don't ask them nicely. You introduce them to the infamous British press gangs. A young man would be enjoying a quiet pint of ale in London, and suddenly, bonk! He'd wake up the next morning with a massive headache, only to find himself miles out at sea. Congratulations, you're a sailor now. Because a lot of the crew were forced to be there, Navy captains maintained order through absolute, terrifying discipline. The ultimate tool for this was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-tailed whip that was feared across the 7 seas. You could be flogged for dropping a tool, talking back, or even whistling. Whistling on a ship was strictly forbidden because it might whistle up a storm. When they weren't working or being punished, sailors slept in hammocks so closely packed you would bump into your neighbor every time the ship rolled. With the terrible food, the harsh discipline, and the terrifying battles, there was only one thing that kept the British sailor from throwing himself overboard: the daily rum ration. Half a pint of pure, strong Caribbean rum every single day. But there was a small issue. Giving half a pint of straight rum to men surrounded by loaded cannons and deep water usually ended badly. So in 1740, Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog, ordered that the rum be watered down. To make the watery rum taste better, sailors added sugar and, you guessed it, lime juice. The legendary grog was born. With strict discipline holding them together, grog keeping them sane, and limes keeping them alive, the British sailor was ready to conquer the world. Now cured of scurvy, the British Navy wasn't just surviving, they were dominating every single ocean. While enemy fleets spent half their time returning to port to heal their sick, the British stayed out for years. A healthy, terrified, and highly disciplined British crew could load and fire a heavy iron cannon in under 90 seconds. That was often 3 times faster than the French or Spanish. The sheer volume of fire was absolutely devastating, but fighting inside a giant wooden box was uniquely horrifying. You see, cannonballs rarely killed you directly. When a 24-pound solid iron ball smashed into the thick oak hull of the ship at high speed, it created a deadly, invisible of massive, razor-sharp wooden splinters flying like spears. If you got hit by one, you were carried down to the darkest deck to meet the ship's surgeon. And in the 18th century, his favorite and only solution to a mangled limb was amputation. No anesthesia, just a piece of leather to bite, and a lot of rum. If the cannons didn't force a surrender, the boarding parties definitely would. British sailors, fueled by extreme discipline, a healthy diet, and very aggressive grog, were terrifying in close combat. Faced with this scurvy-free, unstoppable war machine, Enemies often just surrendered to save themselves the trouble. It became so routine that British captains practically scheduled their naval victories around their afternoon tea time. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy had destroyed or captured almost every rival fleet on Earth. The oceans essentially became private British highways, connecting a global empire that the sun would never set on. Because they never had to go home for sick leave, the Royal Navy invented a horrifying new strategy: the permanent blockade. French and Spanish admirals would look out their windows, hoping the British had finally left due to starvation or disease. But no, the British were just sitting out there for years, fishing, drinking grog, and having tea. This permanent naval shield meant British merchant ships could sail the globe entirely untouched, acting as a global delivery service. Companies like the East India Company brought home mountains of wealth: spices, sugar, cotton, and, most importantly, tea. But it wasn't just about money. Without the fear of scurvy, explorers like Captain Cook could finally map the true unknown. So, the lemon truly built the British Empire. The science was settled forever. Humanity had won. Or so they thought. Because human beings are incredibly good at forgetting things. Fast forward to the late 19th century. The era of the fast, coal-powered steamship had arrived. These ships crossed the oceans so incredibly fast that sailors simply didn't have time to develop scurvy anymore. Because nobody was getting sick, the medical establishment drew the most hilariously wrong conclusion possible. They decided that scurvy had never been about lacking vitamin C. They thought it was caused by tainted, slightly rotting meat. So they started pumping lime juice through copper pipes and boiling it to purify it, which, chemically speaking, completely destroys all vitamin C. The Admiralty thought they were being modern and hygienic. They were actually handing out useless, sour water. This amnesia wouldn't matter for the fast steamships. But when British explorers set off to conquer the frozen, slow, and isolated polar caps, the old nightmare woke up. In 1910, Captain Robert Falcon Scott led the Terra Nova expedition to reach the South Pole. It was a grueling, months-long trek across the ice. They packed what they believed was the best modern science had to offer, including the Navy's boiled lime juice. Of course, boiling the lime juice had completely destroyed all the vitamin C. It was literally just sour, useless water. Their diet consisted mainly of pemmican, a block of dried meat and fat, highly caloric but severely lacking in vitamins. Deep in the Antarctic, miles away from any fresh food, the classic symptoms returned: exhaustion, red spots, and teeth falling out in the snow. The crew was utterly confused. But we're drinking the lime juice, they thought. We shouldn't be getting scurvy. Because of the flawed ptomaine theory, they blamed the canned meat. They believed the meat was tainted. They were completely wrong. When Scott finally reached the South Pole in January 1912, he found the Norwegian flag already there. Roald Amundsen had beaten him to it. Defeated, they turned back. But now, scurvy was fully tearing their bodies apart. Old wounds from years ago magically ripped open. Without vitamin C, your body stops producing collagen. You literally start to dissolve. In minus 40-degree weather, it's a death sentence. Just 11 miles from a supply depot, the blizzard pinned them down. Starving, freezing, and rotting from the inside, they pitched their final tent. Captain Scott wrote his final journal entries as his men died beside him. They perished not just from the cold, but from medical ignorance. The greatest tragedy? The Royal Navy had already solved this exact problem 150 years earlier. They just forgot. A simple piece of fruit, discovered by a doctor on a wooden ship, was lost to the arrogance of the steam age. It took decades more, and the discovery of actual vitamin C in 1932 for humanity to finally remember the lesson of the limeys. In 1932, a scientist named Albert St. Georgi finally isolated the specific molecule that prevented scurvy. He called it ascorbic acid, or, as we all know it today, vitamin C. The mystery was officially solved. The tainted meat theory was thrown into the trash where it belonged. It was never the meat. It was always the missing fruit. When we look back at the British Empire, it's easy to focus on the massive wooden ships, the brilliant admirals, and the booming trade companies. Yes, the Royal Navy was an unmatched military machine. Yes, their discipline was legendary. And yes, the wealth they stripped from the colonies changed the global economy forever. But none of that, absolutely none of it, would have been possible without a logistical breakthrough in medicine. Scurvy was the real gatekeeper of the oceans. The British just happened to be the first ones to find the key. So today, when Americans playfully call British people limeys, they're actually paying tribute to the greatest sour-tasting military secret in the history of naval warfare. And somewhere in history, Dr. James Lind is taking a much-deserved bow. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how the British Empire stole tea from China using one single spy, click the video on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next dive into the insane logistics of history. Until next time, keep your teeth in your mouth and drink your lemon juice.